of you who have been here for every one of them, and you know we've kind of changed what day of the week we do it on and kind of what the program looks like. And we realized this year that there's only one constant that's been across every instance of Fate of the Earth, and that's that we learned early on that we always need to have an environmental journalist talk to us. It's this funny thing I came to realize that actually environmental journalists are pretty good at communicating about the environment. Who would have thought? So this has become a tradition because we've just, it's always worked really well. And of course, as you know, MSU has a very strong environmental journalism program centered around the Knight Center for Environmental Journalism. So we're really pleased this year that we have Emily Holden with us. Emily is, I think I got this right, the US reporter for The Guardian, which is a British paper, but previously has worked for Politico, excuse me, and E&E News, and is an environmental reporter, obviously, and is going to be talking to us about climate and the environment in the age of Trump. And so, Emily?
Hello. Thank you all for being here. So how many people are familiar with The Guardian? Okay, cool. So I like to give this explanation because before I worked at The Guardian, I'm not sure I was exactly clear on these statistics. So I work for The Guardian US. So we have a very large team based out of New York, but I'm in Washington, D.C. with about 6 other reporters. And yes, our institution as a whole is based in the UK, but The Guardian as an international publication actually has more readers outside of the UK than inside now. So we're about a third in the UK, a third in the US, and a third in the rest of the world. So we really think of ourselves as international journalism. My focus is domestic, so I'm one of 2 reporters covering the environment. One's in New York, I'm in DC. We have a big network of freelancers too, and we're actually doubling our team. We've recently announced, so we're hiring a climate change reporter from the West Coast and an environmental justice reporter, if you guys know people who should apply for that. So I want to do something a little non-traditional because my job is communicating, and communicating goes 2 ways. So if I can ask you guys, if I lose you, or if I'm too fast, or you just want me to keep talking about something a little bit more, could you just raise your hand? And I won't call on you for the sake of time. We can wait till questions for that, but just so I have a sense of if people are really keeping up with where I'm going. That would be really helpful. So you've seen some of these graphs already today, but I just wanted to kind of start big picture and narrow it down to show you all the things that an environmental reporter in the US is trying to cover. So this is just showing the history of global surface temperature since pre-industrialization. So as you can see, there's a pretty different impact around the world in terms of temperature alone, and that's having a different impact on the types of extreme weather that we're seeing and how bad the effects will be in some places before others. So places like Bangladesh versus the US, it's going to be a lot worse there before it is worse here. Already is. That can be a little hard to understand, so I like to always come back to this report that I think caught a lot of people's attention this year. The International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the UN put out a report on basically what the difference would look like if we could keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius instead of going higher than that. And it's a very big difference. And we know we've already seen about 1 degree Celsius warming, or 1.8 Fahrenheit, so we're well on the way there. And what they were really emphasizing, and you heard scientists saying this in a way that I really haven't heard them say before, they're using the words catastrophe, crisis, immediate, urgency, and they were really emphasizing this timeline of the next 12 years, which I left this little note at the top. The article is more than 6 months old now, so now we're looking at more of 11 years. So I like to try to update that figure whenever I'm talking to people, just to show how quickly this timeline is moving forward. And this is to put a plan in place and start really ratcheting down greenhouse gas emissions, or as I like to call them because I think it makes a lot more sense, heat trapping pollution. Are you guys familiar with the RCP? Yeah, some people? So I think this is just to illustrate the choices that we have. So I like to really tell people that climate change is a choice that society is making. And so this is showing you the types of temperature range that we could see based on the different things that the world could do. So 2.6 would be like the most that we could curb emissions, and then you have 4.5, RCP 6 and RCP 8.5. I was joking earlier, my boyfriend, who's also an environmental reporter for Halloween, made his Twitter name RCP 8.5. So it's a pretty scary possible outcome, and it's definitely still possible with the trajectory that we're on right now. It's basically a business as usual, so if things don't rapidly change. Just some context of where the problem's coming from. So these are the top 10 emitters about now. This is from 2011. These numbers aren't updated super frequently, but you get an idea. And I think a lot of people have a sense of this, that a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, heat trapping pollution, are coming from China, as well as the US and the EU and India. But this is also really important to keep in mind. This is the historical record. So overall, the US is still the biggest contributor of this pollution that's causing this problem, and China is after the US. That's even clearer when you look at per capita. So the US and Canada, industrialized nations, have a way bigger footprint per person than the places that we're talking about, like China and India. I think a lot of the conversation about climate change and limiting climate change is usually framed around electricity and renewable power and some of the success stories that we've seen about wind and solar. But it's also really important to keep in mind this framework, because as you can see, energy is about 72% of the emissions that we're dealing with, and then electricity is just about less than a third of that. So there are all these other things that the US and other countries would have to decarbonize to address this problem, and all of them outside of electricity are a lot harder than electricity. Electricity is the easiest, really, even though it has been a big challenge. You can switch to a different fuel. You can switch to solar. You can switch to wind, natural gas even. You're getting less of maybe it's 50 to 70% less of a greenhouse gas emission footprint than of coal. But then when you move into transportation or you're moving into looking at agriculture, those are much more difficult challenges. So just to demonstrate the heat and what we're talking about, I think this is an excellent piece of journalism from the Times. And I think you're seeing more and more of this that's really framing this as a now problem for people where they are. So this is a chart you can go in and you put in your date of birth and your hometown, and you see how much hotter has it gotten and how much hotter will it get by the end of your lifetime. So I put in Lansing, and I put in for a 30-year-old. So you can almost see that. So when a 30-year-old was born, Lansing would see about 7 days per year reaching at least 90 degrees. By the time that 30-year-old is 80, there could be 23 of those very hot days. So that's a difference. That's a pretty measurable difference. People would probably notice that. But it's going to be very different around the country and around the world. I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's a very hot place. Anyone who's been there knows that. Don't ever go to New Orleans in the summer for any kind of conference. It's not a good idea. So Baton Rouge, when I was born, could expect 93 days per year to reach at least 90 degrees. By the time I'm 80, that's 131. And then if you look at Bangladesh, they were already at 120 days per year at least 90 degrees for a 30-year-old now when they were born. 242 days. So this is a widely varying impact depending on where in the world that you are, and it's going to strain governments in very different ways. And I think that you're already hearing a lot of those problems from places around the world that have it way worse than the US, but you're also hearing the problems in the US as well. Just to talk about the scale, because I could put up all the charts in the world, but humans don't necessarily think in charts. Some do, some of our scientists do, but I think a lot more people think like this. So there's been a lot of work to try to put a dollar figure on how much climate change is costing society. And probably these numbers come nowhere near it because there are so many things that you have to include. But one figure showed that hitting the toughest climate target would save the world $30 trillion in damages. And the spending now would be far lower than the cost that we're going to see later. There's a lab that I visited at the University of Chicago called the Climate Impact Lab. They are taking up some of the work that was done in the Obama administration to get a social cost of carbon, which is basically a dollar figure for how bad climate change is for us and what we have to spend on it. And that includes early deaths, that includes losses in agriculture, pretty much everything that you could think of. And they had this figure that just really stuck with me from a study in India that found when it's hotter than 20 degrees Celsius, each degree higher in a single day means 70 people kill themselves. And that's largely with farmers because it has such a big impact on the growing season. They can see just like losing a ton of their livelihood with a single day that is that much warmer. So they've estimated that warming has been responsible for 59,300 suicides in India over 30 years because of that. We know that climate change is making drought worse. We talked about that a little bit earlier today, how it's sort of counterintuitive that you could both have more rain and more drought. But like I said, the impacts aren't going to be equal around the globe. We've already seen a lot of this happening in the droughts that are happening. We see it in the heat waves that are happening in the UK. This is the UK and Australia where we have a pretty big footprint. The Guardian does. And then there are things that we know are associated with climate change, but we don't necessarily always make the links. So we know that climate change is causing instability in other countries. This is a story that I wrote with my colleague about the migrant caravan, and we got to talk to some people who told us that they were moving because their coffee crops were failing. And that is definitely associated with climate change. We also know that climate change is fueling instability abroad. A German report laid out specifically how there could be more terrorism recruitment when people are seeing more drought, more crop failures, less job availability, and young people are looking to those sources of power for a way forward in their life. It's a big justice problem because we know climate change will be way harder for developing countries than developed ones. So all the impacts that I talk about in the US are going to be much worse most places in the world for most people. We also know in the US that climate change will be worse for poor people than wealthier people. Just give you a second to look at that. Oops. So this is from the National Climate Assessment Report from the Trump administration that laid out the dangers of climate change and the economic costs to the US. And I'd really suggest looking at that if you haven't. There's a section on the Midwest in particular where you can see what impacts you're already seeing here now. Some of the things that we're already seeing now, I really want to emphasize the point that I think a lot of reporting you see on climate change is framing it as how much worse will this get and when, but it's a now problem. It's a now problem and a future problem, and that's very much backed up by research, by the events that we're seeing. And it's not always as straightforward, would this hurricane have happened with or without climate change? It's more of, would this hurricane have been as bad with or without climate change? Would this flood have been as bad? Would it have flooded in the same areas? We know with sunny day flooding, businesses are already losing a lot of money in places like Annapolis, where the study was done, where I went to visit. And those costs kind of build up in small ways across the economy. So I went and talked to some of the business owners there that said, you know, it was fine when it was once a month or twice a month or 3 times a month, but when we can't open our business for a week a month or 2 weeks a month, we can't stay open forever like that. So we're going to have to move somewhere else, and there's nowhere else in Annapolis you can pick up, and it's a cute little sailing town. Property's very expensive, so most likely these businesses are going to close rather than move somewhere else. So we also know that with extreme weather, climate change has been a factor. But there are, I'm sure many people have seen the stories about the wildfires and how they've been made worse in California because of climate change. But there are also a lot of things that I don't think we typically think about. So I wrote a story from California about the coastal habitats there, and this was a study done by the Nature Conservancy. And they looked at all the places where they thought they might lose estuaries, so this really unique habitat where salt water meets fresh water. And if you've been to California, you know that a lot of the places along the coast, they either have cliffs or development. So they were saying, we have this estuary now, and you would think it would just grow back, right? As the sea levels rise, the estuary would move back interior. But there's not necessarily a place for those estuaries to do that. And so they've been talking with planners at the state government, the local government, about places that they can look where there isn't development, there aren't cliffs, to save space for these really unique habitats to move. Can I do a check-in? How am I doing? Everybody good? Good? Not too fast? Okay. What's happening in DC? So this was the title of my presentation. You've probably seen this. It was a very specific campaign promise of Donald Trump that he would help out the coal industry. And he's done that. And you've seen it happening in many different ways. So one of the earlier signs was when the former EPA, Environmental Protection Agency administrator, said that he would launch a program to critique climate science. And it didn't necessarily happen out of EPA. You saw EPA having a lot of fights with the White House about it, because I think some people at the White House thought that would not be a good battle to get into politically if you're going to pull scientists in front of people who disagree with the scientist and put them on television or other public spaces. But now we've heard recently that the White House is considering doing something like this again in a different format. And it's not just EPA. So as a climate change reporter, I end up covering kind of every agency. And I did this story at Politico where we looked at all of the former comments of people who are in charge of the government and all the decisions that they made that might be against climate action. So everything from housing and urban development to the Attorney General at the Justice Department to the people who write the budget. We know that there's big industry influence. One good example, if you want to look back at this story, there was a letter from Bob Murray, who runs one of the biggest coal companies in the country, laying out all the rollbacks that he wanted to see, and almost all of those have been started. The process has at least begun. Just to demonstrate the scale, it's not just climate change where we're seeing rollbacks. We're seeing rollbacks in pretty much everything that the Obama administration did. In every area of industry, really, relating to the environment. Don't get scared. So this is how regulations are made in the US. So have you seen the How the Bill Becomes a Law video? Okay, so this is the agency version of that, and it's much more complicated. So just like lawmakers can make laws, agencies can make rules. And I put this up just to show you that this page is very dependent on this page. So a lot of the things that the Trump administration has started, they probably won't finish by the end of this term. And on top of that, they've been seeing a lot of lawsuits. And so really more than like completely reversing these things, it puts them in limbo for a very long time while this plays out. And that was true under the Obama administration too. We have a lot of environmental regulations that just sit and sit and sit because this is our government system. So we already know the agencies themselves have acknowledged the increased deaths that you could see from some of these rollbacks in their regulatory analysis, from everything from the methane pollution to the reversal of the Clean Power Plan, the rules for the electricity system. But there are also all these stories that are kind of behind the scenes that I think people don't necessarily get to pay as much attention to. So ways that the agencies are being changed and what science they consider, and who they look to for science advice, and what they're enforcing, and penalties that they're bringing against industry, and their strategy for dealing with industry. And they're being much more favorable to industry, and that they will tell you that they really think that it's better to work with companies to get them into compliance than to punish them to get them into compliance. There are also things that we just might not see happening at all unless there's certain reporting on them. These are two excellent chemical reporters that I would suggest you all follow, especially with a lot of what's going on in Michigan. One is my former colleague, Annie Snyder from Politico, who has written about a lot of the studies that the federal government has on chemicals that are dangerous that they're not telling us about. So one is actually the PFAS family of chemicals they have a study about that we hadn't seen, and the other is formaldehyde, the story on the right. And then Sharon Lerner at The Intercept has also covered this a lot too. So EPA is continuing to allow these products to enter commercial use knowing that they're dangerous. A little bit more on where this puts us all for climate change. So we actually saw an emissions in heat trapping pollution in the US last year. And then there was a report that came out from the Energy Information Administration that really buried the lead on where carbon emissions would be. So they had this whole event with reporters and other people to roll out their annual outlook. And normally the EIA would focus a lot on like what all of these policies will mean for greenhouse gases and where the US would be. But this year they didn't. I had to ask for the chart specifically. And once I did some of the math, found that it looked like out to 2050, with all of the ramp up in natural gas use that's replacing coal, we might see just a couple percentage points decrease in overall emissions, which is not what you're hearing from the administration. You're hearing technology will get us there. We're going to keep seeing reductions no matter what. You know, even with these rollbacks, companies are going to move toward this anyway. But that really depends on just how much natural gas grows and also how much nuclear power goes offline. This is about a year old, so it's probably changed a little bit, but this is from a firm called Rhodium Group. And so they look at how far the U.S. is from meeting what the U.S. said it would do in the Paris Agreement, the international agreement on climate change. And you can see here that it's like definitely not going to happen, but also we could see kind of walking back from where we were, losing some of the progress that has happened already. And a lot of that is because of the potential for nuclear power to go offline and natural gas to replace it. One number that they gave me that I thought was interesting from this too is that they thought that Trump administration policies accounted for about 1% of this. So instead of reaching 17% below, just reaching 16% below, which you might think is really small, but it actually makes a lot of sense when you consider that the U.S. didn't have many climate policies in place before the Trump administration. So the administration is largely just stalling that action, not necessarily reversing existing action. And then this is another thing to think about when you talk about decarbonizing the U.S. economy. So electricity, where we're seeing the progress, maybe, depending on what happens with natural gas, is a smaller sliver than you might think. And after electricity come transportation, which is dependent on electricity. So if we're going to move to electric vehicles, they'll be running on the grid still. So all of its emissions from cars will depend on what the grid runs on. And then it's also much tougher to reduce emissions from industry and agriculture. Most people don't even talk about agriculture emissions. It's kind of, I think, a blind spot in the U.S. climate movement. So what do people think about this? We know that a lot of people really do care, and that number has been increasing for a long time, higher than ever before. You know that people acknowledge that it's happening. Most of them think that it's because of humans. Most of them are worried about it. Most of them support policies to do something about it. But the trickiness of this is when you start asking people what trade-offs they would make, they stop supporting these policies. So when you say, would you pay $5 a month, you get a lot of yeses. When you say, would you pay $20 a month, you get a lot of no's. And you can also see that as much as people care about the environment, they're typically looking at a lot of other issues that matter a lot more to them. Things that they think about every day. So their own jobs, their own health insurance, their kids, their own lack of money, gun control, abortion, immigration. Most of the hot button issues come above environment. And there's a huge split depending on your political beliefs. And just the people who acknowledge the problem and that the problem is human-made. So you can see, I thought this was a really interesting figure, that 72% of people backing Democrats in the 2018 election thought climate change was a very big problem compared to 11% of Republican supporters. So even among the people who acknowledge that it's happening and that it's human-made, there's a very low number of GOP supporters who think that it's a big problem. It's changing. I think it's changing pretty rapidly with the youth movement. There are a lot of young Republicans who are worried about this and who are working on it at the campus level. But also, there's really an absence of climate change, I think, in just how people talk to each other about it, and definitely in the media. So the title here, I think a better way to look at it is that it's more than 50% of people hear about climate change in the media once a month or less. So that's very infrequent. And you see similar figures about how often they're hearing about it from people they know, too. So even though we've seen a huge increase in the big national publications writing about climate change, especially the New York Times, which has like tripled its desk on climate change and is covering it all over the country and all over the world, people aren't necessarily getting that. Not everyone reads the New York Times. A lot of people watch TV news. So last year, climate change in broadcast TV was mentioned for 142 minutes, which was down from the year before. And I think they said about half of that was just a single segment of Meet the Press. That was from Media Matters, if anyone wants to look that up. There's a lot of research going into why people will believe political rumors like that climate change is a hoax, despite seeing evidence. So this man's name is Adam Berinsky. He runs the Political Experiments Lab at MIT. And he doesn't focus specifically on climate change, but he looks at why people believe political rumors from, Barack Obama had a fake birth certificate to climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese government. And what he found is that when you show people who are convinced of a rumor the news, and just with a nonpartisan source, it doesn't really have a big effect on changing their minds. When you add in either a Republican or a Democrat, it has more of an effect. And it mostly has the effect, if you are a conservative, to have a conservative in the story who is saying this is not a rumor, this is happening, and it's a concern, even if that conservative has like very different views from other people in the story on how it should be addressed, right? Just to have someone saying, I think the way that you do, and I think that this is a problem. But he's also found that that effect doesn't necessarily hold. And so I think there's going to be a lot more research into that, into why people revert back to their feelings so quickly. There already is a lot, and it largely focuses on people believing their friends, their family, their industry they work for, their church, things that are much more immediately in their lives than sources like the media that a lot of people, I think, can see as sort of elitist, especially national reporters, people in Washington, D.C. and New York. The other thing that we know is effective is reporting from the local level. So my parents' house flooded in Baton Rouge a few years ago. They got 14 inches of rain. And the most immediate effect you saw was some of the local governments deciding we're going to strip all of the rebuilding standards that we have because we want everyone to be able to come back. So they knew that it was going to happen again, but they wanted everyone to rebuild without having to elevate their homes as much because that's what people could afford. So, and they understood that. That was a rational decision. It's not like they thought that it wasn't going to rain like this again. And very soon thereafter, NOAA came out with this report saying pretty bluntly that climate change increased rains in this event by 40%. But there really wasn't, like, even though that came out very rapidly, there wasn't a lot of discussion of that study. And this is something that is really very new, this kind of attribution study that we're going to see more of immediately after wildfires, hurricanes, floods. But it's been missing before, and I think a lot of social scientists think that this could be key to helping people connect this big picture trend of climate change with what's happening where they are. So just a few of the things that I like to emphasize, and I'd love to take lots of questions. Climate change is not a future problem. It's a now problem and a future problem. I won't read the whole thing to you, but also I think that it can be damaging to frame climate change as either we will fix it or we won't fix it, because that's clearly not what's happening. Limiting emissions will be helpful in any amount. This is a choice that's often being made on behalf of people that they haven't had a say in. And most Americans are concerned about this, but it doesn't always translate into political action. And also, I think a lot of the attention in the media right now is going to Trump rollbacks, which are stalling climate action, but there's no plan in Washington for doing something about climate change, like no actionable plan that lots of people are supporting after President Trump either. So, questions? And feel free to make these about climate change or the media or DC. Back here? Yeah, you. Mm-hmm.
So at the university, we do research, and I think an important part of our role in the policy debate is establishing what people believe to be true about something. I want to know your perspective on what's going on with the administration and research that is done in federal agencies, because speaking from my little world, which is in agricultural and environmental economics, I can say, I visited the EPA office where the National Center for Environmental Economics is, and there are many empty desks. The administration just presented its budget. It includes a 47% reduction for the USDA Economic Research Service, including elimination of all the environmental economic research done at at ERS. So My question is, do you think there's a pattern of trying to suppress research at the federal level that would raise inconvenient truths?
I mean, yes, I think we've seen that documented. One example I can point to is the story in Reveal by Elizabeth Sjogren about a National Park Service report that was looking at the vulnerabilities of national parks to sea level rise and flooding that just took forever to come out. So it's more complicated than just did they let people put it out or did they not let people put it out. Sometimes it's just slow walking it, and it's hard to say if it was because it's about climate change or something else. And sometimes I think you're seeing a lot of self-censoring, sometimes by managers who are trying to protect their employees, and they say, can we maybe call this something else? Do you have to say climate change? Is there another way we could frame this? Could you wait and do this in a few months? And also looking and saying, like, where are you going to be presenting this, and what reporters might be there, and just trying to have a sense of, like, will this blow up, or is this going to be something that the White House ends up reading about us working on? And then you do have a lot of empty desks. And that's one of the slides I was showing about some of the major changes at EPA. EPA has lost several thousand workers that just have left and have not been replaced. So that does have a big impact too.
Just a quick question: if you have a knowledge of any country that has like worst case scenario planning for 8.5, because that'd be really dramatic. But then second question just on tone, because like I've noticed it's shift from like it's going to be bad weather to end of civilization, and I'm curious like how much you guys pay attention to tone and how that can kind of shut down people in fight or flight, and leaving enough hope, and where you strike that balance.
Yeah, there's a lot of research into this too. So one study that I saw that was super interesting. So he was asking about tones. I think like doom and gloom reporting, like is this going to be the end of the world versus solutions reporting, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the first part again?
Just curious if there's any worst case scenario planning that you're aware of. That'd be really dramatic to hear from a governmental perspective.
I don't think so. I'm racking my brain and I'm not sure.
Even the Republicans have it too. They know it's real, so they're worst case scenario planning too.
I honestly think that industry is doing most of the worst case scenario planning. So you see oil companies. Sorry?
Yeah.
The doomsday seed vault in Norway where
yes.
they're storing seeds.
But I don't know if that's specifically linked to like RCP 8.5. But I think you see a lot of corporations planning for worst case scenarios as the expected scenario. So you see oil and gas companies looking at sea level rise and saying they've tasked some given grants at LSU, where I went to school, to students to figure out ways that all of their offshore equipment can float because they won't have land to put it in anymore. Really futuristic looking stuff. And then on tone, yes, that's definitely something we have to pay attention to. So one study I wanted to mention showed that when people are reading about climate change, they're most motivated by fear or hope. And I think those are the two main ways to write about climate change. It's helpful to have both, right? We do want people to understand, like I'm not an advocate, but I want people to understand the situation that they're facing so that they have some say in it. But also we know that people need solutions presented to them. That's difficult because I can tell you all the ways as an individual that you can limit your carbon footprint, but an individual action is helpful and will encourage other people to take their own individual actions, but this is a much more institutional problem, and it's not just in the US, it's all around the world. And those institutional decisions are gonna have a much bigger footprint than individual decisions.
But those individual decisions help you build resiliency to those changes, which is where I find it. I just as a tone thing.
Yeah. I think a lot of reporters are thinking about that. I can tell you more people read the scary stories than the hopeful ones, but that doesn't mean we don't write the hopeful ones. And success stories are important to write about too, so people understand, like I said again, that this is a choice that's being made on their behalf, and there are people trying to rectify this.
Continuing on this theme a little, do you think, are there reporters out there who are waiting or trying to figure out how they'll report on our Pearl Harbor moment if it comes to the environment? Is there any talk about how you would hypothetically report, say an incredibly massive calving of a glacier that now is going to go into the shipping lanes and cause the next Titanic, is there any?
I think we're already reporting those things, right? It's just how they all add up together. that's the problem, is that like reporting, I mean, you saw how many slides that I had to go through just to demonstrate all the impacts that we're already seeing. Where did we go? Like, all of these are the stories telling that, but it's much harder to put all of this together in one story to communicate to people how much the world is changing because of rising temperatures. So no, I don't think there's a plan for that moment. I know some people think that there will be a moment when it gets so bad that the world decides that we have to fix this problem. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, though, because I feel like we're seeing some of that now, and it is not necessarily changing the discussion.
Do you ever publish reports in the vein of a talk like this that summarizes, as you mentioned, it's hard to get the big picture, but that's basically what you've given us today, is that sort of a thing. So do you ever try to publish stories like that sort of survey the past few important stories and try to put it in a larger context?
I think we try to take the opportunity when we see big reports come out, like the National Climate Assessment or the IPCC report, where we know we have people's attention because of that. So this year, the Trump administration put out the National Climate Assessment, but they did it on Black Friday, when a lot of people wouldn't have seen it the day after Thanksgiving. So we spent the next week, we had an item each day drawing out something specific that you'd probably want to know from that report. Another thing we did recently, for the student walkouts for climate change, we had 11 minutes that we made our whole homepage all climate change coverage. So we do that to some extent. I think we could do it more, and I think that is something that broadly journalism is struggling with, because a lot of reporters see themselves as storytellers. I think we're also educators and information providers, but people don't necessarily pay for that sort of thing. Advertising doesn't pay for that sort of thing. Contributions don't. So it's really a delicate situation to figure out how to give people what they need and what they want.
I have a question. So a lot of reporting is informational, educational. I'm wondering, I just forgot my question.
I can come back
I'll
to you.
think of it.
I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Well, I think, as you said, climate change is a choice. And I think that a lot of individuals in the United States, A, don't have the resources to move or rebuild. And you showed one of the pictures in Baton Rouge where, people just want to rebuild. And that's not the answer. And the answer is grassroots efforts and education, because most of us sit around and say, well, we don't want to change. But we have to change if we're going to make a difference. And we need education sessions on how to make those changes.
Yeah, I think we need more local reporting. We've lost so many local publications entirely where they still exist. We've lost environment reporters where they still have environment reporters. They're also the lower education reporter and the courts reporter and the city council reporter. And I think there are some bright spots there where you see investigative reporting being funded in places like Kentucky, and like desks and collaboratives. But I think that the best way to tell climate change stories is at the local level. And we try to do that in our reporting too, but it's never going to be quite the same as having your hometown paper tell you what's happening to you because of this.
A little bit along those lines, I was wondering if you have.
Stand up so we
Yeah,
can
sorry.
hear you.
I was wondering if you have any stories, either from home in Baton Rouge or anything that you've reported on, revolving around national disaster insurance and maybe moral hazards or adverse incentives that those provide for people to stay in high-risk areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just saw it, right? Sorry for all the flipping back and forth. I always hate it when people do this. Almost there? There you go. So yeah, this is my story, and I met this family. They were really put out by this flooding. They had, it was like the mom and her 2 daughters and several grandkids who were all living in the same house that had been paid off by her husband before he passed. And what I was writing about was this decision to ease flooding rules actually in the town over. And a big part of that is the National Flood Insurance Program, which is just completely broken. It's totally in debt. Everyone knows this. There hasn't really been a solution that legislators have come up with. And I mean, the incentives are set up wrong. I think that's like pretty clear from all the reporting, because this town was allowed to just eliminate its rebuilding standards and let people rebuild back lower, and still be able to be part of the National Flood Insurance Program. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to give a whole spiel on NFIP because we'll be here for a while.
Is there any data that suggests that certain kind of reporting is more effective in terms of changing people's attitudes or feelings of hopefulness? I know that I follow the Guardian religiously, as well as other news agencies about the environment, and I'd be willing to bet that most people that read the Guardian or other environmental, articles about the environment already know a lot of what's going on, and they can pretty much predict it. So at this point, to use it for education and raising awareness, it's important. But is there data to suggest that by reporting on stories of successes, what is this country doing? What is that country doing? What is this neighborhood doing? What is this community doing? And how is it impacting the people? Does that have more of a positive effect on the readership versus just reporting that this is happening or that's happening? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's a lot of study of that academically. Unfortunately, a lot of the academic study in journalism never meets with the journalism itself. So I think this is a